joining us for this lunch Listen and Learn series. For those of you who don't know, you guys know. My name is Robin. I'm Public Art Planner of the Public Art Urban Enhancement Division for Arts and Culture Department for the City of Albuquerque. And this is our third Listen and Learn. Folks enjoy these series. We're very pleased to have Audrey Norris here. She is participating in our Juneteenth exhibition up on the 8th floor. On the seats you will find a brochure. If you would like, after Audrey's speech, to go up to the 8th floor, take this with you. It gives you all the information about the artists and their interpretation of what it means to be Black today in Mexico, as well as what Afrofuturism means and Black history across our great nation. If you look on the back, there's a QR code. So take your phone. You want to make sure that your phone works, and just download the QR code. We have a composer from Albuquerque who created an original composition to accompany the show, so I'm really pleased about that. Also, if you love sketching, you love art, we have a Draw It series. This would be our second Draw It series with one of the artists in the interpretive reflection show that you see here. The show is all about self-portraits, and artists notoriously are shy. They don't necessarily want to have their pictures taken, also because of their work. But this show encouraged us to do some sketching, some self-sketching. So we asked folks to just come. We provide paper and pencil. And the artist is Al Nirlara, whose work is in the show. He will be here. So what we'll be doing is 20, 10, and 5-minute sketch sessions. And after that, the artist critiques it, and you get to take some fabulous artwork home. So look for that. It's going to be on our website and on our social media. The date it comes up. And right now, I have the absolute pleasure of introducing Audrey Norris, who is one of the highlights of our Juneteenth show. We're so thrilled that she can join us, and a transplant like myself from Colorado, and really making a mark in the Albuquerque art scene. So I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Robin. Appreciate it. And I want to thank all of you for coming today. So as Robin said, my name is Audrey Norris. I've been an artist, drawing and painting ever since I was little. I was like 7 when I said I was going to be an artist when I grew up. And I did it. So I actually, my family's from Barbados. I was born there. I lived there until I was about 5 years old. Moved to New York, where I spent all of my elementary school years, and then moved to actually Las Vegas, New Mexico. So I'm kind of like a re-transplant of sorts. So yeah, I was in Vegas for all my middle school, high school years, joined the Marines, did a bunch of stuff, landed in Colorado, stayed there for almost 18 years, and now I'm back in New Mexico. And excited to learn more about the New Mexico art scene, New Mexico culture, in a way that I wasn't paying attention to as a child. So I've got 2 pieces upstairs in the Juneteenth pop-up show. My work has been focused on telling the stories of women in history since about 2016. And so that's what I do with my work, and that's what I'm going to be talking about a little bit today. So not only those individuals, but a little historical context and tying all of that into the concept of Juneteenth, the timing of Juneteenth, all the things that's happening around Juneteenth. So here we go. The celebration of Juneteenth is a celebration of freedom. For nearly 250 years in this country, slavery shaped the lives of African Americans. They endured physical abuse, from forced labor to punishments. They worked from sunup to well into the night and then had to do it all over again. So when we complain about an 8-hour day, families were torn apart. They were sold from one another. Native languages of the Africans who were brought in, they were forbidden. They were not allowed to speak their own language, which language shapes how you think. And so they were not able to leverage that aspect of themselves. They were not allowed to read. They were not allowed to be educated about how the world immediately around them worked, other than the work that they were supposed to do. And the idea of escape and the fact of escape was the ultimate sin from the perspective of the slave owners. So even though all of that was true, freedom still lived on in the spirits of the enslaved people. And the thing that I want to focus on today is I want to think about three main aspects of freedom, because I feel like freedom can be defined in so many different ways, so I picked three. And that is freedom of body, freedom of mind, and freedom of imagination. And when I say imagination, it's like looking around and seeing what could be, right? You need the freedom to even think about what might be so that you can actually go ahead and shape it. So I mentioned before, 2 paintings in the gallery upstairs of 2 women in history. One is a portrait of Dr. Mae Jemison, and she was the first Black female astronaut to go into space. The second is a portrait of Clarissa Shields, and she was the first woman ever to win gold in boxing in the Olympics, because it took so long for boxing to be allowed for women in the Olympics. So I'm going to tell you about how they connect to these concepts of freedom and these concepts of Juneteenth. June 19th, 1865, General Gordon Granger arrived in Galveston, Texas to issue Order Number 3, and that was the thing that made it clear to all of Texans that slavery was officially abolished and that the Black people who were working there were no longer supposed to be working for free. And the order goes like this. The people of Texas are informed, in accordance with a proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of personal rights, the rights of property between former masters and slaves, and the connection heretofore existing between them becomes that between employer and hired labor. The freedmen are advised to remain quietly in their present homes and work for wages. They are informed that they will not be allowed to collect at military posts and that they will not be supported in idleness either here or elsewhere. And so a fun thing about American history is that they cannot seem to do right by Black people without issuing a little extra stuff, either loopholes to the thing that they issued or instructions on how to be. But I digress. So this order came down 2.5 years after President Lincoln wrote and passed the Emancipation Proclamation as an executive order that freed enslaved people in the southern states, the states that were trying to secede from the Union. Technically, there were enslaved people in some of the northern states that were not trying to secede. But again, I digress. That's a different story for a different time. So the lore of Juneteenth is that, this was the day that Black folk found out that they had been freed. But technically, they would have known based on the history. One of the things that I came across in my research is that there are actually newspaper clippings, newspaper articles from 1864, right, before the Civil War had even ended, stating, basically talking about the Emancipation Proclamation and a lot of hand-wringing among Southern slaveholders who were trying to figure out, what are we going to do about this thing? Also, because of just the way things were working in the country, a lot of the fighting in the Civil War was happening more in the Southeast. And so as you traveled west, there was a little less policing from the Union Army, which meant that a lot of Southern slaveholders who wanted to maintain their way of life actually moved to Texas during those years, which means that, of course, they knew. Of course, there's no way they didn't know. And there's no way that their enslaved didn't know, because when you are invisibilized, then people just talk freely around you as if you're not there. So they knew. And they were not going to change their ways unless somebody made them. And so when General Granger came through with his proclamation and the army, then he made them change their ways. Even so, this was not a safe environment for Black folk. They knew that attempting to behave in a free manner was dangerous, and so it wasn't until the Union showed up that they felt that it was safe enough to celebrate. And that is when the Juneteenth celebrations began in 1866, so even a year after that proclamation happened. So during these celebrations, one of the things Black folks would do is they would find family members who they had lost track of, bring them together. They would do readings of the Emancipation Proclamation. They would give religious sermons, because there was still a lot of, Christianity during that time period. And they would sing spirituals. In addition, they would preserve different cultural traditions. Food was a big thing, so when we think of barbecues, we think of red velvet cake, we think of, strawberry soda. All of these things, they came about during the time of the Juneteenth celebrations. And they would share stories, stories that have been passed down through generations. And the way I think of it is going back to my freedoms, right? They were celebrating the freedoms of their bodies in that they no longer had to toil for somebody else-ish. Because in the proclamation, what did it say? You're supposed to work now for wages for the same people that you work for. Anyhow, the freedom of mind, because now the bans on education had been lifted. And the freedom of imagination, because now with this newfound freedom, they had a sense of what could be and what they could begin to work toward. So of the people that I painted up in the gallery, I feel like Clarissa Shields best represents freedom of body. She was born in Flint, Michigan in 1995, so if you do the math, she's not 30 yet. Her father was incarcerated when she was 2 years old, and he was released when she was 9. But that life in the in-between times was really, really difficult. Her mother was an alcoholic. She moved the family to 11 different homes in the course of 12 years. She was raped as a child at 5 years old, and so she endured a great deal of trauma in her life. So when her dad came back, that was a game changer for her. He helped her get out of some of those bad situations, and he introduced her to boxing. Her father was the first person to tell her about Layla Ali, Muhammad Ali's daughter, who was boxing. And even though he still kind of had this macho, boxing's not really a women's sport thing going on, he recognized what this could do for his kid. And so when she was 11 years old, he signed the paperwork for her to start taking lessons in a boxing gym. So a thing that Shields has said, she says, without boxing, all the anger and trauma and things I was going through when I was a child, I definitely wouldn't have had anywhere to put that anger. Boxing helped me to learn to control that anger and my emotions and just deal with things a lot better. It kind of forced me to grow up. So when Clarissa Shields was 13 years old, women's boxing was officially accepted into what would become the London Olympics. So London Olympics was scheduled for 2012. And so 4 years before that, they said boxing was going to be on the roster. When she was 16, she qualified for the senior tournament, she participated in a senior tournament, which qualified her for the Olympics. And she turned 17, 2 months shy of the age cutoff, just in time to participate in the Olympics itself in 2012. So at 17, she went to London from Flint, Michigan, and she won her first Olympic gold medal. Now, when I think about freedom of mind, I think about Dr. Mae Jemison. She was born in Decatur, Alabama in 1956. She was always interested in science as a child, fascinated by the stars. She was, constantly stargazing, but she was also interested in everything. She was definitely a Renaissance woman from very young. She was raised in Chicago, and she graduated from high school early and was enrolled in Stanford University at the age of 16. She graduated from there with 2 degrees, one in African American Studies and one in Chemical Engineering. And from there, she went on to Cornell Medical School, where she earned her doctorate in 1981. And this is for medicine, doctorate for medicine. Shortly thereafter, she joined the Peace Corps, and she did some work in Liberia and in Sierra Leone. And afterwards, she did some work with the CDC. Like you can see, there's a very deep medical trajectory, but also a very social trajectory. She applied for NASA's astronaut program in 1987. Now, she was one of 2,000 applicants. Of the 2,000 applicants, she was one of 100 who were interviewed. And of those, she was one of 15 selected. So, beat the competition. And in 1992, Dr. Mae Jemison became the first Black woman to go into space. And she was a mission specialist on the STS-47 Space Lab. This was a joint venture between the US and Japan. And they ended up, in the course of 8 days, orbiting the Earth 127 times. So when we think about history, we think about these moments frozen in time, and especially the way we learn it here in the US. We learned World War II happened, or the US entered World War II in 1942, and, freeze it right there and don't really continue on with the story, like what was the before, what was the after, like a little bit of that, but we kind of just leave it there and then move on to the next date. But more often than not, these things were actually the beginning of the story. So when we think about emancipation, it was like, that's the end of slavery. No, it wasn't. That was the beginning of the end of slavery because there still had to be integration. You had a bunch of people who for generations had been locked into this cycle of servitude, of broken families, of physical trauma, emotional trauma, all of these things, and now they have to somehow figure out how to live in this country as a citizen, as a fully functioning individual. And so because of this, the Freedmen's Bureau was established on March 3rd of 1865, and their job was to help integrate Black people into American society. They resolved disputes both between newly freed people and each other, also between newly freed people and the white folks out in the greater public, because you can change a law, but if you don't change culture, you're still going to have some issues. They helped to resolve legal matters, and they helped people with contracts. One of the things that the early, and of course I've forgotten his name, I didn't write it down, but the early leader of the Freedmen's Bureau, he would notice that folks would get into these messed up contracts because they couldn't read still. And so they would either take deals on a handshake and say, I will agree to work for you for X number of years for X amount of money, and then of course that'd be reneged on. Or they would, sign away things that they had no business signing away because they didn't know any better. And so the Freedmen's Bureau would help with these things. They also helped people find their family members because they had access to all the documentation from the different slaveholders, and so they could figure out who got sold where at what time and help bring families back together. Now, all of these Freedmen's Bureau offices were located at Union posts for the Union Army, partly, mainly, because there was no congressional funding for this organization. So you remember in proclamation in number 3, they said they did not want newly freed people gathering at Union posts. This is why they would have been there. There were job opportunities and job listings at these posts. There was the ability to learn about family members at this post. There was protection on these posts, and so, again, trying to police the movement of people was a thing. Another thing that the Freedmen's Bureau did was that they built schools, because now you have all of these free individuals, adults and children, who need to learn how to read. And so they built all of these schools, and in some cases they actually subsidized Black people being able to attend these schools. And the reason they had to subsidize it is because a lot of white folks were not ready to share that kind of space. And so that was the beginning of early public education in the South, because up until that point, there weren't actually many public facilities, even for the white kids. Unfortunately, the Freedmen's Bureau was abruptly ended in 1872. So started in 1865, ends in 1872, because Congress did not vote for it to stay in. Like, they had to vote every year, and they tried, but there was a sea change in Congress, and so they cut the program. And so a lot of folks, especially from the South, saw it as a handout for Black people when they felt that poor white folks were not getting the same kind of treatment. But whatever their reason, this became a massive disruption in public education for Black students at that time. So I'm going to go back to this moment's frozen in time thing, right? Dr. Mae Jemison. When we think of her as an astronaut. I painted her as an astronaut, but this was just the beginning of her career. So 1992, she goes to space. 1993, she quits NASA, decides to leave the program entirely, and she founded the Jemison Group, which was dedicated to applying technology to social problems. She started that in 1993, right after she left NASA. Within the Jemison Group, she headed a project called Alafia, which is a satellite-based telecommunication system, which helped to improve healthcare in West Africa. Because remember, that's where she was when she was in the Peace Corps, right? She also founded and chairs the Dorothy Jemison Foundation for Excellence, which hosts an international science camp called The Earth We Share, which she started in 1994. The most recent documentation I could find for it was 2014, so I think that camp is done. I may be wrong though, but my internet searches only took me that far. But this was a camp in which she invited international students to come together and help figure out world problems, because she recognized the need for multiple perspectives. So you couldn't just have American kids saying, hey, this is how we solve the global garbage problem, because the globe experiences the garbage problem in very different ways. Moments frozen in time. Clarissa Shields, winner of the gold medal in Olympic boxing in 2012. But that was her first one. 2016, she went to Rio de Janeiro and she won a second gold medal. As an amateur, let me roll back. She is the only American to win back-to-back gold medals in the Olympics in boxing. The only one, male or female. She is the only person to hold 4 major world titles at once in the WBA, the WCA, the IBF, and the WBO. And then she went ahead and did it in 3 weight classes. So if you do the math on that, she has 12 world championship titles in each and every one of these things, because she did it in 3 weight classes, and she intends to do it in a 4th. She's like, I'll just put on weight, drop some weight, whatever, I'll beat up anybody, let's go. She was the fastest person to win 3 separate division world championship belts. Her amateur record, 77-1. The one loss was when she was 17 years old in the early Olympic Games. Her professional record as of today, 14-0. So she hasn't lost since she was 17. So the prize for boxing for women, the top prize, the most money that I was able to find that anybody has won in a boxing purse, $200,000. And that is for this year. That's for 2024. The most money a man has taken home in boxing, $250 million. And that's for the hyper famous. Like, most dudes don't take that home. But like, the most that has been won was $250 million. Compare that to $200,000, they just got to that number. They just doubled it to $200,000 this year. So as you can imagine, Clarissa Shields, being who she is, not particularly pleased with that. So what she decided to do is she decided to go into MMA. Mixed martial arts, women actually win a decent amount of money, 1 to 2 million at least, and there's higher, lower purses depending on where you're at. And so she started training back in 2022. Thus far, she's been in 3 MMA fights. She has won 2 of them and only lost 1. But one of the things that she did was she wanted to bring her fans from MMA, as she built up that part of her career, bring them over to boxing and shore that up. Because, sometimes if you want the job done right, you're going to have to do it yourself. And so this is one of the tactics she took. So back to Juneteenth, right? We left off, Freedmen's Bureau was shut down. And so after that, there were still a bunch of Black people in this country who still needed these services. They needed the legal services, they needed the education, all of these other things. And so different organizations managed to pick up the slack where the government refused to pick up. Over the next 30 years, HBCUs were founded, right? Historically Black colleges and universities, to make sure that Black people in the South were able to get education. Yes, for a time it was mostly leading them towards vocational stuff. A lot of those were started by religious organizations, but it was still a vast improvement over nothing. Also, you had organizations, now we're rolling into the 1890s, early into the early 1900s. Colored women's clubs started forming with the intention of providing social services and also for educating people, especially once women started getting the right to vote in 1920. Colored women's clubs were integral in making sure that these individuals knew what their rights were and how to exercise them. And then you have the National African American League, which again, founded by Black folks themselves, who had managed to get out of their own cycles and were going to bring people up with them. Dr. Mae Jemison, similarly, she is a firm believer that as 2/3 of the population, women and minorities absolutely need to be involved in the sciences. We need to influence what gets researched and what kind of data gets analyzed, because otherwise the things that are going to come about are not necessarily going to serve our needs. She says, having been an astronaut gives me a platform, but I'd blow it if I just talked about the shuttle. So she too understands that this propensity to lock and freeze people in time is actually not helpful. She needs to move past that, and she's taking active steps to do so. Clarissa Shields, in her own right, she went and founded a nonprofit, SCO, Shields Community Outreach, and that was made with the goal to set up and execute youth-based outreach in Flint, Michigan, because she knew that there's so many other kids with the same upbringing as her, and if boxing was the thing that got her out of it, then hopefully it'll be the thing that gets them out of it as well. She and her fiance also launched BYF, Boxing Yoga and Fitness, which is a youth program, which she teaches herself. And the thing that is amazing about this, so in 2022, she was signed up to fight in a championship bout against Savannah Marshall, who was the woman who beat her when she was 17 years old in the Olympics, okay? During the training for that bout, she decided that this is when she's launching that program. So she's training in the morning, and then she's teaching kids in the afternoon, all while planning for a championship fight. And it was noted in one of the articles that I read that she is one of the few superstar athletes who will actually take personal time out to serve her community rather than just kind of throwing money at the situation. I told you the record, she beat Savannah Marshall. She also went on to host the Night of 1,000 Stars in 2023. And this was her fight against Marciela Cornejo. And this is another championship fight. She invited 1,000 kids from Flint, Michigan and their guardians to come and watch her fight for free. And so she was willing to lose out on 1,000 seats worth of tickets in order to make sure that these kids had an opportunity to watch her in this fight. Partly because she's mad cocky, talks more shit than Ali, partly because she, again, knows that you need to sometimes see what's possible in order to be able to imagine what's possible. She won that fight too. So back to freedom of imagination. Right? Dr. Mae Jemison is a small child. Imagine herself in space, even though growing up in the 1950s and 60s, every astronaut she saw on TV was both white and male. and she's this little black girl. Yes, she saw Nichelle Nichols on Star Trek as Lieutenant Uhura and was like, oh, possibility, I see it now. But even before that, she had the imagination to fulfill it. And she was very fortunate that she had parents supportive enough to help her along with that goal, even though teachers were not quite so supportive. Clarissa Shields imagined herself as a champion, even at a time where women were not even allowed to box in the Olympics, so that by the time that came about, there she was, ready to go. So I mentioned earlier, right, she's using her MMA as a way of elevating women's boxing. The way she feels is that as she becomes better and more popular and more famous, she wants to make sure that she's reaching down and pulling others up with her. So it's not just about, hey, how can Clarissa Shields get more money? It's how can women's boxing get more money? How can we bring these little girls who might be the next Clarissa Shields into this sport so that they can see it as an outlet and an out for the circumstances that they're living in? She said, I made the decision that I'm not going to keep waiting for boxing to miraculously realize that women's boxing is important and that Clarissa Shields is a once-in-a-lifetime athlete. She went out and did that for herself. And so that, to me, I think, is on the list of, high on the list of the legacies of Juneteenth, of emancipation. This idea that, like, once you experience the freedom to imagine yourself out of a circumstance, once your body is free to move in the way that you need it to move, once your mind is free to take in and utilize the information that you can get, that's where you can take things to the next level and then bring the next generation with you. Both women have taken it upon themselves to say, this is what needs to happen, and I'm going to be the one to do it. And I'm going to reach down and I'm going to help the next generation to feel these freedoms that we have, right? Dr. Mae Jemison said, people don't seem to be interested in other people's children. They seem to have lost sight of the impact other people's children will have on their children and them and the country's future. And that is the thing that, we need to remember. Like, it takes a village. But it's not just about raising, it's about uplifting, it's about creating opportunities and making sure that the next generation has it better than we did. And that is the spirit of Juneteenth and the spirit of Dr. Mae Jemison and Clarissa Shields.
Thank you so much. We're going to open it up to questions, but I kind of want to get the ball rolling. And everything that you said is so relevant to what is happening now. All artists always have to think outside the box, always have to think creative, always have to use their minds to expand. Mm-hmm. At this juncture, as a Black artist, as a woman artist, do you see us retrogressing or progressing, and how much of your work do you see that you have to do to make sure that young people have that opportunity of mind and imagination?
I feel like it's going both directions at the same time. I feel like if you were to look at policy, right, in different parts of this country, policy is moving backwards. There's elements where people within the culture are working real hard to send things in the opposite direction. And if you look at like social media and the ways in which people connect one-on-one or one en masse, there's a moving forward. And so, one of the things that I've loved seeing, like I got interested in history. I mean, it's been a slow progression, but like really dug my heels in and said I'm staking a claim in history in 2016. From that time, I would go to bookstores and I would see the magazine stands and I would see so many more magazines on history. I would listen to podcasts. I have the list of history podcasts that just I listen to is stupid long. The number of TikTokers and people on Instagram and YouTube who are talking about history and bringing up different facts that we never learned in school is increasing exponentially. There's so many creators out there who are looking and saying, this is the thing that we need to talk about and we need to be aware of. And so it doesn't matter what folks at the top are trying to make happen. The base is too broad. And as an artist, I've been thinking about this for a while too. Like artists have been integral in every movement, from creating propaganda from either side, right? To just creating different ways to imagine how the world could be. If you think of science fiction writers or futurist writers, they imagine the future as it could be. They imagine, they innovate technology and stuff like that before a scientist is actually capable of bringing the thing to fruition. Like, how long were we watching people talk to each other on camera phones before Skype was ever a thing? Right? And so, as an artist, I feel it's absolutely essential for me to be part of that aspect of the movement. And I think I am, and I think a lot of artists are as well.
What are you doing? I mean, I know it's very hard. I have some interest in some of the things that you do, but you do many things that kind of capture people in different places, different levels, different artistic expression in their life, and you go for it and you grab them that way with history. Explain a little bit more about your process and what you do.
Yeah, so, it began with a show. When I was in Denver, there was a coffee shop called Coffee at the Point. I showed there once a year, every year for about 7 years. And, it was in 2016 that I did my first, I call it Women Behaving Badly. That's the name of this series of women in history. And I realized that people really connected not only with the artwork, but with the stories that I put with the artwork. And I would do something similar to what I'm doing now, is I would just point at a piece and tell you about it, and people were really engaged. I had teacher friends of mine actually ask me to come to their schools and talk to their kids about the work that I had done. And so that's kind of how it began. And then opportunities just started cropping up from there. I got a mini grant to do a deck of trading cards for the Colorado Women's Commission. And so I did a deck of women in Colorado's history. And so I've sold about maybe 300, 350 of those. So those are floating around, educating people about 28 specific women in Colorado. I got to work with History Colorado, which is their historical society, on a number of projects, including a giant mural of Ruth Bader Ginsburg after her passing. I did that on the street. Did a mural that was part of an exhibit for the Five Points neighborhood, which was the historically Black neighborhood in Colorado. And so, like these different avenues of like working with educational institutions, and then just the stuff that I do, going out and doing markets and just having one-on-one conversations with people and be like, hey, here's the thing, want to buy my poster? Here's some cards. I've made these dog tags.
See, the dog tags I'm really fascinated by, because it allows people to take history and incorporate it into themselves. And so it creates their own identity. It creates a new brand from your work. And where did you get, well, the military, of course. I'm sure you're sitting there just going, well, I'm tired of these. but it's fascinating that you were able to take that. I think artists always think it in such a unique way, that you were able to take something that can be interpreted so government, so against me, but and then turn it into something that becomes a part of me, and so I learn about me as well.
No, I love it. I've always loved cross-pollination. In learning how to do digital painting, I figured out watercolor because there's an opacity slider in Photoshop, and I was like, oh, what if I did this with paint? And I've always been that kind of person. Like, I work at a skill, and there's the way you're supposed to do it, and then I find out some new skill. I'm like, oh, that relates to this other thing that I recognize or heard of or whatever. And so I do the same thing with like products. I love, like, I'm into fashion. I'm not like a high fashionista or whatever. Like, I like looking good and feeling good. I've worn jewelry for a while. And I remember when I did join the military, I was super into that. I was like, dude, but I got dog tags. So like, I had uniforms, I had boots, I had the military ID, but it was the dog tags that was the thing. I was like, now I'm a Marine. And so like, I remember the excitement of having this accessory, but I don't need to walk around my Social Security around my neck all the time. And so for me to put a woman in history that I admire on my dog tags and make that as part of my self-expression, it felt much more honest in a lot of ways, while still giving me the excitement of I get to wear these things again.
Check out her website; it's amazing. Anybody have a question?
You had mentioned there being so many ways that we can define freedom: mind, body, imagination. And as a visual artist, which of those do you think that you embody, or is there another one that you think fine art and visual art really encapsulates the freedom of blank?
Gotcha. Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. I'm interesting. Everybody thinks, oh, artist, you're right-brained. You're thinking in the realm of imagination all the time. I am not left-handed. I am very much a left-brain thinker. I'm so analytical. So for me, it's definitely a freedom of mind thing, where learning the information is one piece of my artistry, and then the actual physical act of creation is another piece. So I guess perhaps I would combine the two for myself. The imagination is more of a, how do I remix these pieces? I've always described myself as a remixer as opposed to like a creator of things. Yeah, because I'm, my work is very realistic. Like any portrait that you see, it looks like a person. It's not going to look like an abstraction of a person. It's not a cartoon. I'm aiming for photorealism for the most part. And so that's my aesthetic. It's how my brain operates. I have a really hard time abstracting things. And so I deal in the realm of the concrete. Like, what can I show you that exists to make you maybe imagine things differently, but ultimately it's grounded in reality.
Keep going. There you go.
So since you're relatively new to Albuquerque, what are your thoughts and senses of like the art scene, and what are you seeing and not seeing that you could share with any of us?
I'm still learning the scene, to be honest. I go to galleries on occasion, but I tend not to like play in the gallery space as an artist. Commission structure is not my bag. I was like, I'm not giving you 50%. I'm not. It is what it is. But that being said, I remember growing up here in New Mexico and thinking, oh, Southwestern art is mountains and that coyote with the bandana around his neck baying at the moon and cacti, and I'm not seeing that anymore. The thing that I'm absolutely loving is the kind of work that's in this room. These are all self-portraits, but each one is so personal, not only in who it is embodying, but just the individual expression of it. And I'm seeing a lot of that in Albuquerque when I do get to go to different spaces, and it's very exciting. I've not met a lot of visual artists as yet, but slowly but surely I'm connecting to and meeting more. And again, there's like this kind of vibe of, what can we do? How can we help? That kind of thing, which I also find really exciting, and something that I saw in Denver, and it's great that it also exists here.
Are you seeing more of a self-empowerment, as you talked about earlier? Are you seeing more of a self-empowerment of artists here in Albuquerque, or artists in general? I think a lot of times people don't really take into consideration the artists themselves, and now artists are really feeling more empowered to create what they feel, not necessarily what the aesthetic here asks for.
Yeah, I would say it's definitely a combination of those things. That the general self-empowerment that I've been seeing, like in looking on the internet and conversing with artists out there in the greater world, I am also seeing here, which is very cool.
Anyone else? There's always a good question. I was a reporter. There's no such thing as a bad question, so ask any question.
Yes, there you are. Love it.
At the end of your speaking, I didn't want to interrupt, but I'm curious about your dog tags and if you've ever had conflict in
Yeah.
So thank you for your service. But have you ever had conflict of serving in the military?
Like while I was in?
I'm sorry?
While I was in?
Yeah.
Oh.
How is it now?
Yeah. I was known as the free spirit. I actually had a first sergeant tell me.
There can be a free spirit in the Marines? Okay.
Barely.
Yeah.
He didn't say it as a compliment.
Okay.
You know, yeah, I had a first sergeant. First Sergeant Powers be like, Norris is a free spirit. Basically meaning I was not inclined to rules and regulations. That in and of itself was a conflict. I, in the weirdest of trajectories, but very quintessentially me, went from an international boarding school in Las Vegas, New Mexico, or technically Montezuma, New Mexico, to the U.S. Marine Corps.
Wow.
And that was a direct line. Like, I left there, I joined the Marines, and boy, was that a culture shock. And so there were a lot of things that I would find myself speaking up about, against, did not care for the us versus them mentality of the military. So that was not my bag at all. And so, yeah, it was kind of known. Somehow managed not to be written up for insubordination because I was insubordinate. So, you know, there was that conflict within that concept. Then I actually engaged in conflict. I was sent off to the Middle East twice. So I spent 7 months in Kuwait from 2002 to 2003, 7 months in Iraq in 2004. I was military intelligence, so fortunately I was, you know, not out there pointing my rifle at people, but even so, that's a very quintessential part of how the military operates. And then I came back, and the night I returned to Hawaii, I went partying with some friends and left them early because bars in Hawaii close at 4, and I was tired. And got back on base and was pulled over for having expired plates, even though they expired while I was gone. And they put me in the brig for the rest of the night. Marines did that. So, conflict. I take issue. Don't think of that time period particularly fondly, if I'm honest. So, me wearing a dog tags with women in history on it is also a subversion of my own experience with that institution, and kind of my way of sort of transforming things. Thanks for asking.
How do you, in your series, choose or find these women, these stories that you want to tell?
So many different ways. In the beginning, I started with this book, What Every American Should Know About Women's History. Mm-hmm. And it's an interesting book. It's written as a timeline. Mm-hmm. And this was one of the moments where I realized about that whole idea of us freezing people and moments in time. Because this timeline began in 1776, and I think it went into like the mid to late 1990s, because that's when the book was published. But the thing I loved about it was that you would see recurring characters, because it actually continued their stories along the timeline as well, which was very exciting to me. So that's kind of how things began with American history. At the time, I was leveraging my Facebook audience and basically asking folks like, hey, who should I paint next? You know? And then opportunities. So like the very first piece that I painted was a portrait of Lema Bowie, who won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2010 for her work in Liberia, for helping to end a civil war that had basically lasted a generation. And I painted her because this place called the Africa Mall was opening up, and they wanted me to do a live painting, and I was like, I can bring these things together. So Lema Bowie was the person that I chose to paint first, but then it was, you know, white Americans and black Americans, and I was like, wait a minute, I'm literally painting in black and white. Can somebody please give me someone else? Yeah. And so somebody suggested Dolores Huerta, and so it just kind of went from there. The way I found Clarissa Shields, I was actually just listening to a podcast, and she came up in an episode, and I was like, who is this? And I did some research, and I actually didn't paint her for a good 4 years, because I was still kind of focused on like, oh, I got to do the important ones though. And then, realize that A, I'd had enough clout, made my point, I could paint whoever I want now. But B, she actually is incredibly important, especially as I consider what she's doing now. I follow her on Instagram so I get to see all the stuff, And so, yeah, it just really depends, like, what is the opportunity that arises, and how do I meet that opportunity with my mission, or who am I really feeling right now?
Before we close out, unless there's another question, with the current climate, we're watching history being made, history being reshaped. We also see people who want to reshape the history in ways that we're not comfortable with. With all that said, and you being someone who really looks at history and where women are headed in terms of who we are and participating in this world, how do you foresee your artwork shaping up, and what do you think that needs to be done for artists to protect those rights so we can continue to express themselves openly?
Ooh, that's
just
your
one. Yeah. Just a small question.
I operate from a place of mistrust, if I'm perfectly honest. I don't trust institutions to protect rights for me. I hope they will. I maintain a level of cautious optimism. And as I see things fall into decline, then my rebellious instinct kicks in. That insubordinate Marine is like, well, you say this, but I'm going to do it anyway. And so that's kind of where my mind goes. However the country chooses to take shape or allow itself to be shaped, I am still here. And anything that I can do to chip away and shift it back, to encourage people to be equally subversive and make sure that they at least can get their needs met, to do it. I'm like, if this is a situation where we're doing it for ourselves, then so be it.
By any means necessary.
By any means. Not any means. I feel so. The moment you say any means necessary, we open ourselves up to a very slippery slope. And so I try to be conscientious of how I use language in that sense. And I do want to recognize that, yes, sometimes that which is lawful is not just, and that which is just is not lawful. And so, by keeping that in mind, I want to always operate in a space of justice wherever I can.
Let's thank Badger for being here. Again, feel free to talk to her about her work, and again, go to her website. The website's amazing. If you have not been up to the 8th floor, I do encourage you to get up there and see the exhibit is up there. It comes down on the 31st. And again, check our website out. We have amazing programs in public art. There's always something going on. The next in-gallery thing that we have is our Draw It session. Please check it out. Make sure that you know when the session is. Come join us. We are also part, what did I do with it? Of an amazing census program. We want everybody to know that we are looking in all arts. We're in our second phase, going through Bernalillo County right now. And so we are checking out what people have interpreted as art in their lives, and what we want to interpret as part of our city's burgeoning art collection. So thank you so much for joining us, and join us again.
Thank you.